The most feared cartel boss in the Western Hemisphere may be gone, and the timing couldn't be more politically loaded. For years, El Mencho, the man who built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel into a military-grade empire that embarrassed the Mexican government, outgunned federal forces, and flooded American streets with enough fentanyl to kill a continent, was untouchable. Intelligence agencies tracked him, bounties hung over his head, and yet he survived. Every raid, every drone, every informant, he survived all of it. Then Trump returns to the White House. Within weeks, the CJNG's command structure starts cracking. Operatives get rolled up, supply chains get disrupted, and now El Mencho himself is reportedly dead. That's not coincidence. That's either the most extraordinary intelligence operation in modern cartel history, or it's something the American public is only being allowed to see part of. Because here's what nobody in mainstream media is asking. Who benefits most from this? And what was the actual price paid to make it happen? Let's start with what we actually know. Because in a story like this, the facts themselves are already extraordinary, and the gaps between those facts are even more revealing. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, from a regional drug trafficking operation into what the DEA publicly described as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the planet. Not in Mexico, on the planet. That distinction matters, because we're not talking about a street gang that got ambitious, we're talking about a paramilitary empire that acquired drones, rocket-propelled grenades, armored vehicles, and communications technology that rivaled small nation-states. The CJNG shot down a Mexican military helicopter in 2015 in broad daylight using a rocket launcher. That's not cartel behavior, that's insurgency. And El Mencho sat at the top of all of it. So when reports started circulating that El Mencho was dead, that this man, this ghost who had evaded capture for over a decade, despite a $10 million DEA bounty on his head, despite Mexican federal operations, despite the full weight of American intelligence interest, when reports said he was gone, the first instinct for anyone paying serious attention was not relief, it was suspicion. Because men like El Mencho don't just die quietly, their deaths, if they happen at all, are events. They send shockwaves, they trigger succession wars, they reshape the entire criminal and political geography of a country. And the fact that this is being reported in fragments with no official confirmation from the Mexican government, with no body, no press conference, no verified intelligence statement from Washington, that silence is the story. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and I want you to stay with me on this, because the geopolitical layer is what most analysts are completely ignoring. Donald Trump came back into office in January 2025 with a very specific and loudly declared agenda regarding Mexico and the cartels. He didn't just say he wanted to fight the drug war harder, he went further than any American president had gone before. His administration began formally pushing for the designation of Mexican cartels, including the CJNG, as foreign terrorist organizations. His people started openly discussing the possibility of unilateral American military action inside Mexican territory. That was not rhetorical. That was a negotiating position being broadcast to the Mexican government, to the cartels, and to the American public simultaneously. And the Mexican government, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, found itself in an impossible position, caught between the domestic political reality of Mexican sovereignty and the economic reality that the United States represents nearly 80% of Mexico's export market. That leverage is not subtle, it's existential. So what do you do when a country with that kind of leverage over you starts making very public demands about the cartels operating on your soil? You either push back and absorb the consequences, which Mexico tried briefly, or you find a way to give them something. And here is where the reported death of El Mencho becomes not just newsworthy but geopolitically significant, because if the Mexican government, under enormous American pressure, facilitated or allowed an operation that eliminated El Mencho, whether through direct action, through a coordinated intelligence handoff, or simply by withdrawing the protection that men at his level often quietly enjoy, then his death isn't just a law enforcement outcome, it's a political payment. It's Mexico handing Washington a trophy, and trophies of that magnitude come with price tags attached. And that is the question that nobody is seriously asking in the American press. What did the United States give Mexico in return? Because this is how geopolitics actually works. This isn't a morality play where the good guys finally caught the bad guy. This is a negotiation, and in every serious negotiation between a powerful state and a weaker one, the weaker party doesn't simply surrender something of value without extracting a concession in return. So if Mexico gave up El Mencho, either actively or passively, what did they get? Tariff relief, a quiet agreement on deportation numbers, a softening of the terrorist designation push, some private understanding about American military incursions that will now never happen because the political need for them has been quietly satisfied? We don't know. And the fact that we don't know, that the American media is treating this as a simple cartel story rather than a diplomatic one, tells you something important about the quality of analysis being offered to the American public right now. But let's go even deeper, because there's another layer here that touches on something I think about quite a lot, which is the relationship between power, narrative, and the management of public perception. Trump's political brand, and I'm being analytical here, not partisan, is built substantially on the idea of strength, on the idea that America, under his leadership, gets results that previous administrations couldn't or wouldn't get. And the reported death of El Mencho fits almost perfectly into that narrative framework. Think about what this story does for the administration's political positioning. It says, we came in tough, we pressured Mexico, we designated cartels as terrorists, and within months the most wanted cartel boss in the hemisphere is dead. That is an extraordinarily powerful political story. It doesn't require Trump to have personally ordered anything. It doesn't require a Navy SEAL raid or a drone strike. It just requires that the pressure, the posture, the designation, the threat of military action created conditions in which this outcome became possible. And if that's the case, then even if Trump's involvement was entirely indirect, the political credit flows to him anyway. Now, I want to be careful here because I am not saying Trump orchestrated an assassination. I'm saying that in the real world of geopolitical pressure and state-level negotiation, the line between diplomatic coercion and operational involvement is far blurrier than the clean categories we prefer. When you tell a foreign government that their cartels are now designated terrorist organizations and that your military reserves the right to operate in their territory, and that government then produces a dead cartel leader, was that your operation? Partially. Was it their operation? Partially. Did both governments benefit? Clearly. Was the public told the full truth about how it happened? Almost certainly not. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is just the ordinary, unremarkable mechanics of how powerful states manage their relationships with weaker ones. Let me bring in some historical context here because I think it's useful. The United States has a very long history of using cartel and organized crime dynamics as instruments of geopolitical leverage. This goes back decades. During the Cold War, American intelligence agencies had documented and acknowledged relationships with drug traffickers in Southeast Asia, in Central America, in South America, relationships that were justified at the time under the logic that the strategic objective outweighed the moral cost. We're not talking about ancient history. The Iran-Contra affair involved drug trafficking networks. The CIA's relationships with Nicaraguan Contras who were moving cocaine into American cities is not a fringe theory. It was investigated by the United States Senate. Gary Webb reported on it. He was destroyed professionally for doing so, and then years later, the reporting was substantially vindicated. The point is not that every powerful person is secretly running drugs. The point is that the American national security apparatus has a long and documented history of being pragmatic, which is a polite word, about who it works with and against in pursuit of its strategic objectives. So when we see the CJNG's primary competitor, the Sinaloa cartel, taking enormous hits in 2024, including the extraordinary moment when Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of El Chapo, apparently lured top Sinaloa leadership into a trap and handed them to American authorities, and then we see the CJNG also losing its leader in 2025, it is completely reasonable to ask whether there is a strategic hand somewhere in the background of all of this. Because the timing and the pattern are not random, the Sinaloa cartel was historically the cartel with the deepest institutional relationships with certain Mexican government factions. The CJNG was the disruptor, the upstart that challenged the established order. Both are now taking catastrophic leadership losses within a very compressed period of time, and both losses are happening during a moment of maximum American pressure on Mexico. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in geopolitical analysis are not accidents. Here's what I think the honest, clear-eyed analysis looks like. The Mexican government, facing devastating economic pressure from Washington and the very real threat of being politically humiliated by unilateral American military operations on its own soil, made a calculation. That calculation was that the political cost of sacrificing El Mencho, whether through active cooperation with American intelligence or simply through the withdrawal of whatever passive protection had kept him alive this long, was lower than the cost of continued confrontation with the Trump administration. That's a rational calculation. It's an ugly one. It has enormous implications for Mexican sovereignty and for the longer-term dynamics of cartel power in that country, but it is rational, and Trump, whether or not he had direct operational knowledge of how this happened, benefits enormously from the outcome. His pressure campaign gets validated, his narrative gets reinforced, and Mexico gets to quietly pocket whatever concession was privately negotiated while publicly presenting this as their own law enforcement success. Now, what does this mean for Americans? Because I think this is where the conversation needs to land. On the surface, you might say, great, a dangerous cartel boss is gone, the streets will be safer, the fentanyl flow will slow, and I understand that instinct completely. The fentanyl crisis is real, the deaths are real, the devastation in American communities is real, and it is ongoing, but the removal of one leader from a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise does not dismantle the enterprise. It never has. We've seen this play out enough times now to know the pattern. Pablo Escobar died and Colombian cocaine trafficking continued. El Chapo went to a supermax prison and Sinaloa continued. Every time a cartel leader is removed, what follows is not the collapse of the cartel. It's a succession struggle, a period of violence, and then the eventual consolidation of power under new leadership that often proves even harder to track and disrupt than the old leadership. Institutions outlast individuals. That is as true for criminal organizations as it is for nation-states. So if the goal was truly to protect Americans from fentanyl and cartel violence, removing El Mencho, even if confirmed, is a tactical gesture, not a strategic solution. The strategic solution would require addressing the demand side of the equation inside the United States, which is a politically uncomfortable conversation. It would require genuine structural reform of the financial system because cartel money doesn't stay in Mexico. It gets laundered through American banks, American real estate, American shell companies. The financial architecture that keeps these organizations alive and growing is largely based in the legitimate global economy, and touching that architecture means touching powerful financial interests that have very effective lobbying operations in Washington. That conversation never quite gets had. Instead, we get the trophy, the dead cartel boss, the political victory, and the underlying system hums along. I also want to touch on something that I think is genuinely under-examined, which is what the reported death of El Mencho means for the internal power dynamics of the CJNG itself and for Mexico's security landscape going forward. The CJNG under El Mencho was extraordinarily centralized. He ran a tight, brutally disciplined organization. The discipline and the fear he commanded personally were significant parts of what held the structure together. When a leader like that disappears, the organization doesn't smoothly transition. It fractures, regional commanders start making independent decisions, alliances shift, violence spikes as factions test boundaries. In the short term, the communities caught in the middle of that restructuring pay an enormous price. Mexican civilians in Jalisco, in Michoacán, in Guanajuato, they are not going to experience the reported death of El Mencho as liberation. They are going to experience it as the beginning of a new and unpredictable period of danger. That's the reality on the ground that gets lost when the story gets filtered through the lens of American political wins and losses. And finally, and I want to leave you with this because I think it matters, we still don't have confirmation. We still don't have a body. We still don't have a verifiable official statement from any government with actual authority on this question. And in that vacuum, multiple possibilities exist simultaneously. El Mencho may be dead, he may be gravely ill, which has long been rumored, given his reported kidney disease. He may have quietly surrendered or been captured in a way that both governments are managing very carefully for reasons neither wants to make fully public. He may have simply disappeared into a retirement that powerful criminal figures occasionally negotiate. We genuinely don't know. And that uncertainty is itself meaningful, because for a figure of this significance in a story of this magnitude, certainty should not be this hard to establish. The fact that it is tells you something about the layers of interest involved in controlling this particular narrative. What I know, what I am confident in, is that this story is not what it appears to be on the surface. It is not simply the long overdue takedown of a notorious drug lord. It is a window into the way geopolitical power actually operates between unequal states. It is a case study in how American administrations use threat, pressure, and strategic leverage to extract outcomes that serve their political and strategic interests. It is a reminder that in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, nothing is clean, nothing is free, and every headline carries beneath it a much longer and more complicated story that the people involved have very strong reasons not to tell you. Pay attention to what gets confirmed and what doesn't in the coming weeks. Pay attention to what concessions quietly emerge in US-Mexico relations. Pay attention to what the CJNG does next, because that's where the real story is, not in the headline but in everything that follows it.